This is Rebirth of Evil, read and narrated by Rod Mortin. Chapter 1. The passageway narrowed as John crawled on hands and knees. He had always loved to explore. He had never really been bothered by confined spaces. His headlamp illuminated the slimy walls that now took a turn downward. Did he dare go further? If the space narrowed too much more, he could plunge downward, and then what? Be stuck upside down in a slippery underground tunnel? Of course, he could also be stuck head down in a pool of water. At least it would be a quick death. Something inside John pushed him to risk the unknown. All of his 17 years, he'd languished on this backwater planet, always feeling out of place, always looking for something more. Everyone here was told to accept others as their equals, but deep down, John knew that he was more than just an equal. His destiny didn't lay in the path of sameness that guided so many of his friends and neighbors. His ancestors had been greats, the rulers of whole planets and most of the galaxy. Maybe they hadn't always been kind, but they took bold leadership to bring stability and steady progress. At least that's what his granddad said. With a quick impulse urging him forward, John crawled forward into the tunnel before he could change his mind. The next thing he knew, he was sliding downward at an accelerating pace as the channel turned sharply downward, and John was plunged headfirst into shockingly cold water. Tendrils of fear gripped him as he realized he had no choice but to swim further into the murky darkness. His hands brushed the sides of the channel ahead of him, making him pull back as he realized there was a wall in front of him. What if this was a dead end? John felt around and discovered he could swim upward. His lungs burning and his heart pounding, John swam upward and hoped for at least an air pocket. What he found was much more than just a pocket of trapped air. His head broke the surface, and he reached out to cling to the stone edge. Whatever this was, it was pitch black. Without a choice, John opened his mouth to gulp in some air, and found it stale, but enough to calm his breathing. Maybe he wasn't going to die today after all. John pulled himself onto the stone floor beside the water, and let himself settle while his eyes adjusted to the darkness. He could just make out objects on the wall not far away. There seemed to be enough headspace for him to stand, so he cautiously got to his feet. Hands in front of him, he moved slowly toward what he thought was a wall, only to hit something with his leg that clattered to the floor. Bending toward the sound, John found what felt like a chair that had fallen on its side. He probed the darkness with his hands and felt what might be a desk or a bench. John followed the outline of the bench until it angled back toward the wall. Now he guessed he was standing next to the wall of his chamber, and he began to search, being careful where he placed his feet, lest he end up back in the water. John's hands found protrusions coming from the wall that felt a bit like boxes or perhaps switches. He moved the levers of what might have been a switch, but nothing happened. His explorations took him a little bit further along the wall. He began to suspect the chamber was not just a tiny air pocket, but he needed more light before he could be certain. His fingers found a large, smooth, raised object that fit the palm of his hand. John probed the edges of the object and found it was raised, perhaps on a short pedestal. Later he would recall that he had no idea of its function, but simply decided to push on it and to see if it moved. To his shock, the object moved further toward the wall, followed by a click and a low rumble. John blinked as lights flickered on in the chamber. As his eyes adjusted to the brightness, John could now see the chair laying on its side in front of a long, narrow bench that served as a desk along the wall. Gauges and dials peppered the wall above the bench, and looked like a door was recessed near its far end. John moved over to examine the items on the bench, and found a small gathering of notebooks, but nothing that explained who made the place or its functions. After examining the baffling gauges and dials, he moved to the door. It had a crank wheel in the center, of a kind that John had seen in books about underwater craft. He cranked the wheel and pulled the door. It took all of his strength to get it to move just a few centimeters.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?